welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome for a fresh new episode of All Things Policy. Offices are reopening and congestion is back on roads in India. Traffic queues and overpriced autos have also made a comeback. Now, as a think tank in the most thriving and entrepreneurial city of the country, it becomes an imperative for us to think about this extremely frustrating yet seems like unsolvable problem. So to think about and solve India's transportation problem, we have with us Anand, who also happens to be an alumni of ours. Anand is the ex-co-founder of Vogo. He's now at a leadership position at Chalo, a transport tech company. We are also joined by my colleague Sowmya Nandan, who heads corporate engagement at Takshashila. Welcome to All Things Policy, Anand. To pass the ball right in your court, what is this India's transportation problem and how have you decided to solve it?
Thank you for that introduction, Ritul. So let me start by telling you what I think is the largest problem in India, especially from an urban perspective, right? So fundamentally, something we all understand is infra in India is fairly limited, right? And this has been tried to be solved by both public and private players in multiple ways. When you look at most cities in India, it takes maybe 2 to 2.5 times more time than it does to get from point A to point B than it does in most other cities in the world. At the same time, the share of wallet versus the per capita income is also 2 to 2.5x higher, right? And that's where the fundamental problem starts, right? And in India, we've tried to solve this, like I said, with both public and private players, but we have done it not from a mass perspective, right? What we have done is scaled up more and more of private modes of transportation, right? We sell more bikes, we sell more cars, there are more cabs, more autos, means in which with limited infrastructure, selling more and more cars does not really solve India's problem. Making the roads wider, making our expressway wider does not necessarily solve congestion and time taken and money spent to actually get from point A to point B, right? What does work and what has worked globally is solving for mass transit, right? Solving for public transport in a much more effective manner, and also making sure that people are able to access this public transport better, right? Now, I have luckily had the opportunity to work at places which are solving both for the public transport piece and also solving for both for first and last mile and getting people closer to public transport. But I think the one fundamental principle that we should all align on is that it's a combination of how do you make the public transport system better from an infrastructure perspective and how do you get more people to access it more easily. And that is, in a nutshell, both the problem and the solution.
All right. So what you mean is essentially that we need to improve the public transport. Now, as I understand that there are problems in order one to reach that public transport, and it's not designed in a way that, plus like the structure of our cities is not as such that the public transport could be right next to our door. Plus, the cities are not walkable in that sense. So there has been a rise of this new segment called micro mobility in the last few years, which is sort of end-to-end connectivity to that public transport, and which is where your area of expertise lies in. Could you expand on that how do you see that solution fitting in?
So like I touched upon, the larger problem is how do you actually get to that public transport, right? Public transport is not near your doorstep. It is probably 2 to 3 to 4 kilometers away, right? So how do you, and there are two ways you could sort of do it, right? For that kind of distance, you need a form factor which is small, right? And which is fairly efficient in taking you from point A to point B in the lowest possible price. The most efficient way to do that is walking, right? But most cities typically lack infra to walk, which means that there aren't footpaths in most cities to actually footpaths with lighting in the night in terms of even purely in terms of safety to take you from point A to point B safely to make you reach either a bus stop or a metro or a train station, right? Which is where we actually came up with the idea of solving this via micromobility solution. And micromobility is fundamentally, as the word indicates, a way to solve for short distance commute, right? And specifically short distance commute, which enables you to make those 3-4 kilometer trips from public transport to your final destination, right? And we played this out over like a 7-year journey with Vogo, where we went from almost nothing, right, 4 or 5 years back, to almost 15,000 scooters across both Bangalore and Hyderabad. And specifically in the city of Hyderabad, we actually saw more than 50% of our rides start and end at a metro, right? We saw people actually coming and getting down to the metro immediately using a Vogo to go get a bunch of errands done in that area, or use it to go drop it off at their office or drop it off at their home and then come back later in the day, right? We saw real last mile, first mile kind of solutions happening, right? And we were able to work very closely with both metro and bus authorities to make a lot of the stuff happen over the last 6-7 years. So the belief is that transportation overall of a city gets solved when you, like I said, you get more people into public transport, and things like what we do, what the bike taxi solution which Rapido and a bunch of other companies in India do, are primarily focused, or primarily should be focused, on making sure more people get into a bus or a train in India.
All right. And I think this is also not just from the connectivity or last mile point of view, but huge cost difference. So when I moved to Bangalore, I was staying in Harloor, and which is really far from my office where I work in Church Street. And to travel 17 kilometers one way every day, the cab services would nearly cost me about 500 rupees per day, per trip, in fact. So 1,000 rupees per trip. And I think after 2 weeks, I got my scooter, and then it was like 200 rupees per week. Now, there is just this complete mismatch in terms of what it cost when you own a two-wheeler versus when you rely on cab services. But at the same time, what personally has been my experience of scooters in India is also it's extremely unsafe, because even in a city like Bangalore, only CBD, which is Central Bangalore District, has roads. Even CBD has roads which are not compatible for you to really ride upon. I mean, you go near Alsur, the
Ritul,
roads are terrible. Yeah.
just to add, or rather go a little further to what Anand explained, I also think that the parking issues are not yet resolved, right? A lot of times, I, being in Bangalore, being an enthusiast of metros, I want to take metro, but there is no parking space. But two-wheelers have a lot of promise there, right? Because it's easier to park, and most of these stations also provide for two-wheeler parking. So, Anand, maybe you could also tell us about how that's worked in your favor.
Yeah. So I'll speak to what Ritul said and what you said as well, Sowmya, right? So specifically in India, right, the installed base of two-wheelers is extremely high, right? And we don't have lanes which are designed either for cycles or scooters or cars, right? And fundamentally, as a nation, also, we don't have lane discipline to actually fall for that, right? To actually follow something like that. I think that's where safety comes from. There, it comes from how we drive, and not necessarily from scooters being unsafe as a product, right? And the second piece of the puzzle is to speak to what Soumya said, right? And even what you said, Ritul. Ideally, you don't want to be going from Harloor to Church Street via a scooter, whether it's your own scooter or a scooter taken from a Vogo or anybody else in this space, right? You want to be taking a 2 kilometer ride, dropping it off at a metro, hopefully the metro which will come here on Agara Road, and take a metro for 80% of the distance and use a Vogo for maybe that 10, 15, 20% of the distance, right? And that fundamentally then reduces congestion, because you are now not adding a scooter for 20%, so for basically a 17-kilometer on infrastructure which is already heavily overloaded, right? And that's the direction that we see this actually playing out with, right? That as public transport infrastructure improves, it is still never going to be near your doorstep, and still never going to be accessible to most people within that 500-meter distance which, say, people are comfortable walking, right? So how do you solve that problem between 500 meters and 2-3 kilometers where you want to use public transport but you can't walk there, right? And that's where this sort of fits in. Ownership is less important, right? So for example, we have parking infrastructure in a lot of these metros which is separate in nature, right? Beyond what the government provides for two-wheelers and cars, we would either rent it or we would basically take that separately and pay more for it, so that we get more customers at public infrastructure around, like I said, a metro or a bus station, right? The more interesting thing, by the way, which has happened recently is, like I said, we got bought out by Chalo earlier this year. And post that, we are now doing this same thing that we used to do at the metros at bus stops in Bombay, right? There are a few hundred electric vehicles that we have now deployed in Bombay, which where the ride starts at bus stops, right? We are working with the BEST to do a pilot where you can actually start these vehicles at bus stops and eventually, hopefully, book both a bus ride and that final scooter ride to take you at your destination in the same pass or the same ticket.
Thank you, Anand, on that. Another major hurdle that I personally feel is in shared economy, how do you sort of build a system of trust that these expensive vehicles that you put out on road, where you are giving to people, which I don't know, will be using in whatever way it is supposed or intended to be used. So, and plus there will be theft, maintenance, and anyway, like it's not safe to park a bicycle out in open in India. So, how have you sort of dealt with at a very rudimentary level kind of challenges about safety, security, and theft, and the quality of vehicles to be ensured to be maintained?
Got it. So first thing is, this problem statement, right, is not as large as it seems from the outside in, right? Typically, our maintenance costs are 1.5 times higher than what it would be if you owned your own personal vehicle, right? And that's because of all the risks that you basically pointed out, right? People drive it worse than they would drive their own vehicle and so on and so forth, right? The second piece of the puzzle is again around theft and vandalism, right? Do people break vehicles? Do people steal vehicles? The answer is yes, right? Does it disproportionately change the business model or affect the P&L? The answer is no. It's fairly limited. We would see maybe single digit percentage theft over like the life cycle of the vehicle itself, right? So that's not actually a game changing thing in the business model, right? And the way we've been trying to reduce that number also is to sort of move towards vehicles which are more and more rugged and which have lesser resale value. So there are 2 3 things in which we've done it. For example, right, we moved from gasoline into electric vehicles, right? And when we moved from gasoline into electric vehicles, the vandalism of parts and the vehicle actually has crashed very significantly because of 2 3 things. One is basically move from fuel to electric, right? And people are not going to steal electricity from a battery, right? Versus we used to have a lot of fuel theft when we had this with gasoline vehicles, right? That's number one. Second thing is the parts of the vehicle themselves, right, are have a resale value in the market, right? When you take a brake, when you take any part of the vehicle, they can be fitted from a gasoline vehicle of Vogo and then put in some other gasoline vehicle. Hence, they have a resale value, and hence there is again spare part theft and things like that, right? The third thing is just the overall ruggedness of the vehicle itself, right? How do you sort of, if the vehicle falls down, do parts break, right? Does the life of the part reduce, right? Whether it's the side of the vehicle, whether it's some other piece of the vehicle which is exposed to the elements. Now, for us, what we've seen is that moving towards electric, moving towards customized vehicles, and moving towards more of like metal body vehicles in terms of moving from a plastic to a metal vehicle has actually largely reduced these problems by, I would say, a factor of like 70-80%, right? Because once you make the body metal, it's not likely to break. Once none all the parts are customized, there is no resale value, and there's hence no actual inherent value from theft apart from maybe somebody having fun with breaking something, right? And the third piece of the puzzle, like I said, maintenance costs. With an electric vehicle, the maintenance costs are significantly lower than that with a gasoline vehicle. So we have seen that during the move from gasoline to electric over the last year, all of these problems have just crashed. And even before, they were not the game changing problems, but they were problems that would impact our brand, right? You would see vehicles damaged, you would see vehicles with parts removed, which in turn would impact what people saw or thought about a service like this, right? I think that has actually come down very drastically for us over the last year.
So I've seen a lot of people wearing Vogo helmets, whereas I've also caught them otherwise being a little more irresponsible or rather casual about not wearing. So how do you guys kind of essentially ensure that's put back? Because that's one of the things which is out there, right? It's not even like you need to pull off a part of the vehicle. So any stats on how the safety is kind of imbibed in it or gives a sense of responsibility for the person who rents the vehicle and the helmet?
Got it. Fair enough. So this is something, by the way, when COVID came, we actually stopped working on in a large way, and we asked customers to start bringing their own helmet, right? Because the risk was post early 2020 that the helmet would actually be a source of transferring a virus from one person to the other, right? So from March 2020, we actually stopped working on this problem, right? Pre March 2020, what we basically used to do was solve by putting helmet detection sensors, taking feedback from customers as to whether there was a helmet or not, and then replacing. We were also actually building out like a separate box that you would attach to the back of the scooter, which would only contain the helmets and which could be removed, and your ride would end only if you have actually put the two helmets back in, right? But that's something we never productized, because when COVID came, that's something we stopped working on, right? At this point, what we have done though is we have moved our fleet entirely into low power electric vehicles, right, which are at a 25-kilometer top speed, and hence you actually don't wear a helmet, because these are the like bicycles in that sense, right? They go only at a 15-kilometer kind of speed right now.
All right. Thanks, Anand.
Thanks,
But
Anand.
this
Thanks a
was,
lot
I
for
would say, with gasoline scooters, this was an unsolved problem. It was not a problem that we had satisfactorily solved. I saw our helmets, competitor helmets, everything being worn by everybody. At some point, it became like a marketing tool of sorts, a very strange one, but a marketing tool nevertheless.
All right.
Thanks, Anand. And I think an important takeaway for us here is that how do you solve product problems by design, or like even societal problems by design here? Like you mentioned that just by putting metal bodies or shifting the transition to EVs, that you can't steal oil or gasoline anymore because it isn't there. So I think that's a good, important key takeaway. Let's take a break now, and we will get back with some more questions, which will be rather on our side of the turf. All right, welcome back. Now, Anand, I want to move to sort of what we do, which is policy, regulation, understanding the government, the interplay of state and state economy and citizens, etc., business. So, to begin with, how has your tryst with policy and policymakers been in this realm? When you entered, when you were creating Vogo, how regulated was it? Did regulations fall upon the entry, or like how has this landscape evolved? How were the fines settled? I'm sure these guys were breaking the rentals, were breaking laws. Who was paying for it? So, just your tryst with the state and policy to talk about it. And two, is that we all know that you took our course, which is the graduate certificate in public policy. And how do you see that in the larger scheme of things aligning for, so to say, for a founder or a senior business leader? That how did it help you in any way? How did it help, like, your experience of it, and how it changed the way, or if in case it changed the way in any case? So yeah, your thoughts on all of this.
Okay, so let me pick that up one by one right now. More
Yeah.
specifically, the Vogo experience, and then about GCPP and how that sort of fit in, right? So on Vogo per se, we were lucky that there was already a regulation in place for renting scooters, right? And this came out in 1997, right? And I'm not sure who came up with it in 1997, but both for cars and for scooters, there were specific laws passed under, I think, some section 66 of the Motor Vehicles Act, a central level, and a bunch of states had also already notified that law, and hence we could actually just go and apply for a already existing permit or a license, right? So in that sense, I think we got really lucky, where a lot of the new age models on transportation, which are trying to solve transportation in different ways, were not envisaged by the government, and hence need some form of law to be legal, or and tend to operate in the gray area till that point in time. So we were lucky that we were never in that position where we had to operate in a gray area, because like I said, somebody wrote a law, right? And the law basically said that you needed to be a business owner with 5 vehicles, and you needed to have a place to service these vehicles, and as long as you have these things, you can apply for a permit, and bunch of folk will sign it, do a bunch of internal meetings, and get it to you in a few months, right? So we are lucky that that was in place, and so there was a process in place on how to work with the government, and there were no surprises in terms of that this is a new thing which is coming up, which did not exist before, right? What we brought to the game and what we changed was the fact that we said that these scooters are not going to be handed over with keys. There will be keyless entry and things like that. But that was not fundamentally changing the nature of the business, which was you were renting out an asset to a customer, right? Luckily, even insurance covers for this, right? You renting a vehicle. So there is whiteboard plate, which is for an individual. There is a yellow board plate, which is for taxis and a driver taking you somewhere, and there's a blackboard plate for you basically driving it yourself. And this was envisaged like 25 years plus back, right? And so we went through that process in multiple states and ended up getting permits. So in both the states that we did, do operations at scale, which is Karnataka and Telangana, we were able to actually get this in place very quickly. We even went to 5 6 other states where we didn't eventually start operations and were able to get these licenses in place in a matter of weeks or months, right? And that was very heartening, because I've seen that this, for a lot of companies in the transport space, for years you stay in the gray area, right? Now, apart from this, obviously, on a regular basis, whether it is weekly or whether it is monthly, there are issues, right? There will be accidents, there will be XYZ kind of problems which happen on the vehicle basis, right? And there again, we were lucky that as a part of the Motor Vehicles Act, there was also insurance in place which sort of covered for all use cases, right? In terms of own damage, third party damage, any kind of issue with the vehicle or the person. The law, and as well on the motor vehicle side as well as on the insurance side, already captured what happens in each kind of use case. So I think from that perspective, we got very lucky that we didn't necessarily need to, work on the making new laws to make what we were doing legal.
And now about the most important question. What do you think the importance of studying public policy at Takshashila for founders and senior business leaders?
Got it. So I did the Takshashila course for GCPP back in 2017. I was lucky to do it with Sowmya. And at that time, she wasn't working for Takshashila, but still, right? So for me, I think the big learnings were actually very early on, right? In the first few sessions, where, my view of government was more along the lines of, why doesn't the government do all this? I was a couch potato, maybe still am, but somebody who looked at it very outside in and thought about, why can't all these things that should happen? Why can't the government change so many things and move India 10x from where it is today, right? Why doesn't stuff work? I think the Takshashila course fundamentally gave me a grounding on what is possible, what is not possible, why do stakeholders act in certain ways, how have incentives been designed. I think one of the biggest things I remember from the course that for a lot of times it's very good for the government to either, the best case of action, maybe for the government to do nothing or to just nudge something rather than pass a law, because a lot of things can play out in very unexpected ways and you could cause more harm than good by doing something in the first place, right? And I've seen a lot of that now play out over the last few years. The second big piece for me was writing down a policy and saying XYZ should happen, versus and then saying the execution side is the problem is not good enough, right? And I think that's something that Takshila folks say a lot in your newsletters and your podcast, that the idea or the policy is not good enough if it doesn't cover for issues in execution, right? Maybe I'm wording it wrong. And I think that's something I've fundamentally taken in my business as well, right? Where it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, it doesn't matter whether you have laid it down. If you have not taken in large margins of error, not accounted for people's incentives and how things will play out, then you've actually not thought through it well in the first place. It's not good enough to do strategy and direction. It's very, very important to figure out what can go wrong in execution, right? I would say those are the major learnings. And I think these learnings are transferable to large organizations as well, not necessarily the government, right? Or whether you work in policy or not. Because in my head, the problems with government and the pros and cons of government, the power and the issues with governments are very similar to what you would see in very, very large organizations, right? Maybe you see them at a smaller scale, but top management putting down strategy, direction, but not accounting for issues, not knowing, having ambitions which are significantly ahead of your competence, not accounting for the fact that you have tens of thousands of employees and government is the largest employee with probably hundreds of thousands, not accounting for what can go wrong and what you can actually get done, right? I think that's a problem in both corporate and the government. And in my head, if you start to think of these things as transferable generic learnings, irrespective of whether you're involved in the policy space or not, a lot of what I learned in GCPP is a generic skill set, right? Which I would find useful. And to me, I think the quality of the course came significantly up to 10x because of the faculty. I don't think I've had faculty walk me through concepts in a way that I saw a lot of the Takshila faculty teach me anything in, right? And which makes it memorable, even though it's now been 5 years.
Yeah, Anand, that's like a good recap of what we did at the course. And it actually makes me smile that when we played the Nagara and as well as did the final assignment on universal basic income, the kind of fun we had with data. So I think everything has played up well for you with BOGO then and now Chalo.
Thanks, Sowmya.
Whatever. So I was reading this article in New York Times yesterday called Economics Isn't Dismal, It's Useful. And it's by a professor called Justin Wolfster. And she mentions that how it's about everyday economics. Like, and this particularly is very relevant to all of us. Opportunity cost or so many concepts which we learn in GCPP are just playing out in life every day, unintended consequences for that matter. They're always there, but we just don't anticipate it. So, yeah, I mean, I echo whatever you were saying. Now, this is one of my last questions, Anand, and which you also briefly touched upon. I want to understand, as somebody who's in transport tech and at the helm of the mobility churn in India right now, how do you see the upcoming EV electric vehicle transformation happening? How conducive is the policy landscape? How thriving is the innovation landscape? We've seen hiccups with a lot of scooters that have come in market, etc. So just your thoughts on these. I know you already mentioned that by design EVs safer in rental scooters. So just some more elaboration on that if you wish.
Got it. So, just conceptually, when you think about electric vehicles, right, from an economic perspective, electric vehicles make sense if you are running more kilometers, right, and not if you're running less. Think of it as the difference between diesel and petrol, right? You buy a diesel car as you buy a petrol car if you know that you're going to run more kilometers, and a diesel car is more expensive than a petrol car, right? So, economically, that's how you think about electric vehicles, where it is going to be costlier upfront, but it makes more money for you as either as a owner, personal owner, or a fleet owner if you're going to run more kilometers than average, and there's a certain break even, right? And this is the concept across all form factors, whether you're talking about a two-wheeler, a car, a bus, or a truck, right? And hence electric economically lends itself well to commercial use cases. Right now, commercial use cases could be on a rental scooter, could be on a Tata Ace which moves cargo going electric, it could be on cars or on buses which are running, few hundred kilometers a day and not 20, 30 kilometers a day, right? And the reason I'm talking about economics first is that, as we understand even on the policy side, that both from a customer perspective, from the government perspective, and from a corporate perspective, something scales to a large extent only when it first makes economic sense. Obviously, there is a huge impact on the environment by going electric, and as and when renewable source percentages in India continue to increase, that impact will automatically increase. But it's important to understand where it will penetrate first, right? So if you break it up that way, the commercial use cases are then limited to buses, trucks, and Tata Aces and the micromobility space, right? Of this, the largest existing space is the Tata Ace cargo pickup kind of space, right? Where you're moving goods either for a traditional or an e-commerce industry from hub to hub, from city to city, right? And hence the cargo truck kind of business is where there's a maximum potential for electric vehicles to start making economic sense on day one. The second piece would be buses where buses are moving 150 plus kilometers on a daily basis. This could be intercity, or this could be a heavily used intra-city bus. And the third piece is micro mobility, where you're doing EV scooters. Just to sort of give you a sense on, because it's something I'm working on now. In Chalo, we are actually deploying like 100 electric buses this year, right? And there in Bombay actually, and there the math also makes a lot of sense, because we expect to run more than 150 kilometers, right? Which is slightly higher than what a typical gasoline bus is running, or it's a use case in which a electric bus will actually make always more money because you've crossed the benchmark where the upfront cost versus how much you save on a per kilometer basis, because electricity is cheaper than diesel, right? That benchmark has been crossed, so we intend to actually launch at a fairly large scale, right? So this would be like the first private EV bus fleet in India, because right now everything is government contracted buses for electric in India today. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now I come to my final question, which is about scooters. Like, how do you see the role of scooters in Indian society? This is more of societal question. The role of
Sure.
scooters in Indian society, as this is from anecdotal, empirical observation, that I've seen scooters to be incredibly transformative in terms of providing mobility to young people, mobility to women particularly. And so, like, where do you see the scooter in the from a societal sense? And two would be maybe on a tangential note that do you intend to go like also expand to avenues other than micro mobility? Like, are you looking at scooters from tourism point of view or other things?
Ritul, just to add to that, Anand, so that you don't have to answer two different questions, an extension of that would be for me, a lot of women whom I interact with see this more like an empowerment, right? Because at home, there are constraints in investing in a vehicle because there's one particular person who wants to use it and the usage is not at max. So, I mean, do you see an audience there? And secondly, even in terms of like say Swiggy or Zomato person also using Wogo. I'm thinking, is there some tie-ups you all officially have, or it's just like any other individual user that you see this happening?
Just
Got
one
it.
more. Sorry, Anand, to bombard you with all this, but this is more of a sort of observation or a reflection. I think in the last 20 years, two things have impacted Indian business landscape in big ways. One is WhatsApp, one is Activa scooters. I mean, the entire small trading has moved to WhatsApp. You can place orders. So much has moved to WhatsApp, and it's become such an easy tool to exchange. And similarly, Activas. I mean, every business has countless Activas, and the way it's transforming business landscape is, I think it's huge. There is somewhere a study that needs to be done about these two things.
Yeah, fair enough. I think the sales of two-wheelers in India actually just show how that actually played out, right? And Sowmya, I don't know if you remember, there used to be these TVS Scooty ads 20, 25 years back where
Yeah.
the father is giving his daughter his, a TVS Scooty, and
Yeah.
that's the first scooter. That was, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that was up there in terms of leagues of advertising, right? And I think that
Absolutely.
actually, really represents what scooters, meant in India, which is you turn 16 or you turn 18 and you get your first scooter, which actually makes you mobile, lets you
Yes.
explore something beyond where you can reach on a bicycle,
Absolutely.
or a friend taking you somewhere, or your family taking you somewhere, right? It's like a huge unlock just as a person, right? And then beyond that, as enabling you to get to work, enabling you to become a part of the consumption economy. I think mobility is very, very fundamental there, right? But I do expect that as things change over the next 20 years, that scooters will start to become more commoditized, less aspirational, right? And the reason I say that is again from a hope that in the next 10, 15 years we will actually see public transport work in India, say the way it works in Europe, right? Where you will never be more than a kilometer or 2 kilometers from the nearest access to public transport, and it will take you to where you need to go. And hence a scooter will be more commoditized. It will be something that you will take for shorter trips, not use it to actually run the 17-kilometer ride that you've been running, Ritul, and more as a very utilitarian kind of setup, right? And base level scooters like the Activa will, in my head, go in that direction, right? And if you want to buy a scooter, ideally it should be because it's a luxury item, right? You want to buy a high end scooter, you can afford it. And let's say what the bullet means in India, to people, that okay, I have arrived, right? And hence I own a bullet. And in my mind, the scooter motorcycle industry will move in that direction over the next 10, 20 years, right? And I say this with hope more because for that to happen, the public transport infrastructure also needs to move up 10x from where it is today.
Just another thought, Anand. So, do you also think that, say a Rapido kind of an option, right? There are women who actually prefer going in a two-wheeler as a pillion because they find it more safe and convenient, even in terms of cost. So, what's your thought on that?
No, absolutely. I think these are two sides of the same coin, right? So once you have the public transport infrastructure in place, right, when you think again 10 years out from here, then
Hmm.
whether you ride your own scooter, let's say like a Vogo scooter to get there, or you use a
Hmm.
Rapido bike taxi to get there, it's the same thing. The point is that you
Hmm.
don't need to own it, right? It becomes more of
Yeah.
a asset that you own for the period that you basically use for the period that you're using it, right? Pay for, sorry, for the period that you're
Hmm.
using it, right? Now, you drive or not is a secondary piece of the puzzle.
Interesting. Yeah. lot of women are going to feel more empowered. I don't know if you've ever heard in Pune, there's a bike festival that happens where all the women get their own bikes and it's a huge halla gulla. So sometime soon we'll see it across cities and of course your bikes there too.
I grew up in Pune, by the way, so I spent
Yeah,
like 20 plus years in Pune. So I think at least anecdotally, it has the most amount of women riding bikes, scooters across the country. Yeah,
yeah. Now that you're in Bangalore, we'll see it happen here too,
yeah,
isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah, for sure.
Sorry. Yeah, yeah. Wonderful.
By the way, this problem exists not only in India, it's actually in most emerging countries. So,
Mm-hmm.
as a part of what I'm doing, I am actually setting up Chalo's business in both in Bangkok and in Manila, right? And I've had the chance to travel 2, 3 times in the last few months. And
Mm-hmm.
the problem of accessing public transport, the problem of using public transport in a effective manner, right? Both accessibility, infrastructure to reach there. These continue to be problems. I think some of these countries have done it better than us in some ways, but it
Okay.
continues to be inadequate. It continues to be something which is not easy to reach, and insufficient from number of buses or number of trains per 100,000 people, however you would measure it.
Thank you so much, Anand. This was a fantastic conversation, and I say this as a fellow scooter optimist and a climate skeptic. So this, I think, really serves as a very optimistic conversation. Thank you, Sowmya. Thank you
Yeah.
for joining us. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
We will catch you in another episode of All Things Policy.
Thanks, Ritul. Thanks, Sowmya.
Bye, Anand.
To be here.
Nice talking to you. Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.